My name is Elena Ward. I'm in my late 30s, a project manager by profession, the kind of role that exists to make other people's lives run smoothly without ever drawing attention to itself. If you asked most people in my family to describe me, they would probably use words like quiet, dependable, and sensitive, maybe even too soft. I've learned that when people don't know what to do with your calm, they often mistake it for weakness. I've never been the loud one at the table. I don't interrupt, I don't compete for airtime, and I don't turn every disagreement into a performance. For years, that meant I was easy to overlook, easy to assign tasks to, easy to speak about instead of to, easy to define without ever asking who I really was. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone, humiliating them, or proving that I was right all along. It's about something quieter than that. It's about how subtle disrespect grows when it's left unchallenged, how roles get assigned without consent, and how loyalty sometimes comes from the last place you expect, when you've already stopped hoping for it. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of a Christmas dinner that changed the way I understand family. Not because voices were raised, not because anything dramatic happened in the moment, but because one sentence, said casually, confidently, revealed years of unspoken assumptions about my worth. My sister announced, in front of everyone, that I was unworthy of this family. Not in anger, not as a joke, but as if it were a simple fact. And for a brief moment, no one disagreed. What follows is not a fast story. It unfolds over time, through small cuts rather than one big wound. You'll hear about the ways I learned to stay quiet, the reasons I convinced myself it was easier not to push back, and the internal shift that happened long before anyone else noticed anything was different. You'll also hear about my cousin, the person I least expected to stand up for me, and why that moment mattered more than any apology ever could. Loyalty, I learned, isn't always loud, and it isn't always aligned with hierarchy, age, or proximity. Sometimes it comes from someone who's been watching quietly, just like you. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I think many people will recognize themselves in it. The one who keeps things together, the one who's present but rarely defended, the one whose value is assumed rather than acknowledged. If you've ever wondered how much silence costs you over time, and what happens when you finally choose clarity over acceptance, this story is for you. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was never meant for you? For most of my adult life, I knew exactly who I was to my family, long before I fully understood who I was to myself. I was the reliable one, not the successful one, not the admired one, not the complicated one who needed special handling. I was the one who showed up early and stayed late, the one who remembered birthdays, dietary restrictions, seating arrangements, and the quiet preferences no one else bothered to track. If something needed to be organized, smoothed over, or quietly corrected without embarrassing anyone, it somehow ended up with me. No one ever formally assigned me that role. It just settled, like dust. At family gatherings, I was usually positioned slightly off-center. Not exiled exactly, but not central either. Close enough to be useful, far enough to be ignored when conversations turned important. I'd be in the kitchen refilling drinks while decisions were made in the living room. I'd be clearing plates while stories were told about people who really had drive or knew how to assert themselves. And I told myself I was fine with that. My sister, Mara, was the opposite of me in every visible way. Confident voice, sharp opinions, a way of speaking that made people lean in, even when they disagreed. She had always been treated as a force, someone whose reactions needed to be managed, whose approval mattered. Growing up, I learned quickly that harmony depended on keeping Mara satisfied. If she was calm, the house was calm. So I adapted. I learned to read rooms instead of dominating them. I learned when to speak, and when silence would be rewarded with temporary peace. Over time, that skill became part of my identity. People would say things like, "Elena's just easy," or "she doesn't mind," or my least favorite, "she understands." Understanding, I realized later, can be a dangerous reputation to earn. When relatives introduced me to friends or partners, it was always framed in terms of what I did for others. She's the one who helped us move. She's amazing in a crisis. She keeps everyone grounded. No one ever said, "She has strong boundaries," or "She expects respect." Those weren't qualities they associated with me. And again, I let it happen. Not because I didn't notice, I noticed everything, but because invisibility, when it's familiar, can feel safer than being seen incorrectly. I told myself that being underestimated was harmless, maybe even strategic. After all, I wasn't being attacked. I wasn't being openly insulted. I was being overlooked. At holidays, this dynamic became more pronounced. I was always the one asked to arrive early, just to help set up. Always the one who stayed behind to clean, while others relaxed. If I declined, there was a subtle shift in the room. Nothing overt, just a tightening. A sense that I was breaking an unspoken agreement. So I rarely declined. What I didn't realize at the time was that by accepting that role so consistently, I was teaching people how to treat me. Not through words, but through repetition. Through my willingness to absorb inconvenience. Through my silence when jokes were made at my expense. Never cruel enough to protest, just sharp enough to sting. No one ever asked how I felt about any of it. They assumed, and assumptions once settled are hard to dislodge. Looking back, I can see that my family didn't think of me as fragile. They thought of me as durable. Someone who could handle being last. Someone who didn't need defending. Someone whose absence wouldn't disrupt the structure because she was part of the foundation, not the design. And foundations aren't thanked. They're only noticed when they crack. At the time, I didn't think I was sacrificing anything. I believed I was choosing maturity, choosing peace, choosing love expressed through service instead of demand. But there's a difference between generosity and erasure. I just didn't have the language for it yet. This is who I was to them before Christmas dinner. Not unworthy, just unquestioned. The first time I felt it, truly felt it, I almost dismissed it as my own sensitivity. It happened years before that Christmas dinner, during a late summer family barbecue. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just a moment so ordinary that it would have disappeared completely if I hadn't been paying attention. We were all standing in the backyard, paper plates balanced in our hands. Someone had asked a question about travel plans for the holidays, where we might go, who might host. I offered a suggestion, calmly, the way I always did. It wasn't even a strong opinion, just an option. Mara laughed, not a cruel laugh. Not loud, just a short, dismissive sound, paired with a glance toward our aunt as if to say, "You know how she is." Then she said, "Elna doesn't really get how these things work." That was it. No insult attached, no explanation, just a sentence delivered with confidence, as though it were a shared understanding. The conversation moved on instantly. Someone else proposed a different plan, and that was the end of it. Everyone else let it pass. I remember standing there, plate suddenly heavy in my hands, trying to understand why my chest felt tight. Nothing objectively bad had happened. No one had yelled at me. No one had corrected Mara. But no one had questioned her either. That was the cut. Small enough to rationalize. Subtle enough to ignore. But sharp enough that I felt it hours later, replaying her words while I washed dishes alone in my apartment. Elena doesn't really get how these things work. I asked myself the questions I always asked in moments like that. Was she joking? Did I misunderstand her tone? Was I overreacting? Those questions were familiar. They were my way of smoothing over discomfort before it could turn into conflict. I told myself that Mara was just being Mara, direct, unfiltered. That everyone knew she didn't mean harm. That if it really bothered me, someone would have said something. No one did. What stayed with me wasn't just what she said, but how easily it was accepted. As if my perspective carried less weight by default. As if my presence in the conversation was provisional, allowed but not authoritative. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how that same pattern echoed in smaller ways. My suggestions would be bypassed until repeated by someone else. My concerns would be acknowledged with a nod and then quietly set aside. If I pushed gently, the room would cool just enough to signal that I was becoming inconvenient. So I stopped pushing. I told myself that this was just how families worked, that not every thought needed to be validated, that confidence mattered more than correctness, and Mara simply had more of it. But something had shifted internally. I began to notice how often I was framed as someone who meant well, rather than someone who knew what she was talking about. How my calm delivery seemed to undermine my credibility, even when I was right. Especially when I was right. The most unsettling part was how quickly this dynamic became invisible again. Life moved on. Holidays passed, new conversations replaced old ones. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But I remembered. Not with anger, with awareness. That first small cut taught me something important. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in familiarity, and leaves before anyone thinks to stop it. And once it's allowed to pass the first time, it learns it can return. After that barbecue, nothing changed on the outside. And because nothing changed, I told myself nothing needed to change. That's how normalization works. It doesn't demand your agreement, it only asks for your silence. The comments didn't escalate, they multiplied. Small enough to be deniable, frequent enough to form a pattern if you were looking for it. I started hearing versions of the same message, delivered in different tones, by different people, but most often by Mara. Elena's just being cautious. She worries too much. She'll help, she always does. Each statement on its own sounded harmless, even complimentary. Together, they shaped an identity I hadn't chosen, someone useful, compliant, and ultimately non-threatening, and I let it stand. Part of me believed that speaking up would make me seem defensive. Another part worried that if I pushed back, I would be accused of being dramatic. I had seen how that label worked in our family. Once applied, it erased the substance of anything you said afterward. So I adjusted instead. I softened my language even more. I added qualifiers. Maybe. I could be wrong. Just a thought. I learned to preempt dismissal by dismissing myself first. It felt strategic at the time, like a way to keep my ideas in the room, even if they entered quietly. What I didn't realize was that this habit trained others to do the same. At gatherings, I found myself automatically reaching for tasks, clearing, arranging, fixing. It was easier than contributing to conversations that felt subtly hostile. Easier than watching my words be filtered through someone else's confidence before they were taken seriously. People noticed my availability, not my absence from the dialogue. And when I did speak, really speak, it was often reframed. If I raised a concern, Mara would translate it into something simpler, something safer. If I disagreed, she would repackage my point with more certainty, and suddenly, it was hers. No one called it out, not because they were malicious, but because it had become normal. I told myself I was choosing peace, that families were imperfect systems, and this was my role within them. I reminded myself that Mara wasn't cruel. She didn't insult me directly. She didn't exclude me outright. She just overshadowed. And I adapted to the shadow. The rationalizations came easily. She's just more assertive. She's had more practice being heard. This isn't worth disrupting relationships over. Each explanation soothed the discomfort just enough to keep me quiet. But beneath that calm, something else was forming. A private ledger of moments. Times I'd been spoken over. My competence had been subtly questioned. At times, my silence had been interpreted as agreement. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was tired. Tired of constantly calibrating myself to fit into spaces that never quite made room for me. Tired of being dependable without being defended. Tired of knowing that if I disappeared from a conversation, it would continue uninterrupted. But if I stopped helping, the absence would be immediately noticed. That realization unsettled me more than any single comment ever had. Still, I stayed. I showed up. I smiled. I played my part well enough that no one questioned it. Normalization isn't loud. It's repetitive. It teaches you what's expected by rewarding compliance and cooling toward resistance. Over time, you stop seeing the edges of the box you're in because you've learned how to move comfortably inside it. By the time I noticed how small my space had become, I had already learned how to make myself fit. And I told myself that was maturity. It wasn't until much later that I realized I had been cast in a role without ever auditioning for it. In my family, every person seemed to occupy a clear position. There was the outspoken one, the peacemaker, the successful one, the fragile one who needed protection. These roles were reinforced through repetition, through stories retold at gatherings, through the way people were spoken about when they weren't in the room. Mine was quieter. I was the reliable background, the one who filled gaps without drawing attention to them, the one who didn't need checking on because I had it handled. When something went wrong, I was consulted. When something went right, I was rarely mentioned. And because I performed that role so consistently, it became fixed. At some point, I noticed that my presence was assumed rather than invited. Family plans would be made with the expectation that I would help, host, organize, or cover whatever detail no one else wanted to manage. If I hesitated, even briefly, the room would respond with confusion rather than consideration. But you're good at this. We thought you wouldn't mind. You always do. Those phrases weren't questions. They were confirmations of an identity they believed I had already accepted. What struck me wasn't the expectation itself. It was the absence of curiosity. No one asked whether I wanted something different. No one wondered if I was tired. My willingness had been mistaken for capacity, and my capacity had been mistaken for obligation. Mara, especially, seemed comfortable speaking for me. If someone asked whether I could take on a task, she would answer before I could. Elena will do it. And because I often did, her certainty went unchallenged. I told myself this was efficiency, that it made sense for the most capable person to handle things. Refusing would create unnecessary friction. But underneath that logic was a quieter truth. I had become predictable. And predictability, in social systems, is often exploited, not out of malice but convenience. I wasn't being seen as a full participant. I was being used as infrastructure. The moment this became clear wasn't dramatic. It happened during a planning conversation for a family event. I offered an alternative approach, one that would have reduced stress for everyone. Mara listened, nodded once, and then said, "That's not really your lane." Her tone wasn't sharp. It was casual, final. No one objected. The conversation moved on as if something obvious had just been clarified. Your lane. I remember thinking how strange it was that my lane had been defined so precisely by someone else, that my competence was acknowledged only within certain boundaries, that outside those boundaries my input was considered unnecessary or even intrusive. And again, I said nothing, because challenging the role would have required more than a correction. It would have required redefining how everyone related to me, and at the time, I didn't believe I had the right or the energy to do that. So I stayed useful, I stayed agreeable, I stayed quiet. But once you see the role you've been assigned, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often your value is tied to what you provide rather than who you are. How praise comes in the form of relief rather than respect. How your absence is felt only when something goes undone. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Because roles that rely on your silence are fragile. And once you stop performing them, everything shifts. I didn't stop yet, but I began to understand the cost of continuing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come from a confrontation or a breaking point that anyone else could see. It happened on an ordinary afternoon alone. I was sitting at my kitchen table, going through old notes in the leather-bound notebook I'd carried for years. Most of it was practical, lists, reminders, plans. But tucked between those pages were observations, things I'd written down without fully realizing why. Dates, phrases, patterns. I had always been someone who documented, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. Writing helped me understand what I was feeling when I didn't yet have language for it. That afternoon, as I flipped through those pages, something clicked. This wasn't random. The dismissals, the assumptions, the way my sister spoke for me, the way others accepted it. It all followed a logic. A role I had been playing, reinforced by repetition and rewarded with conditional acceptance. And the most unsettling realization of all was this: I had been cooperating with it. Not because I was weak, but because I believed that harmony required self-erasure. Because I had internalized the idea that asserting myself would cost more than it was worth. Sitting there, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a different question. Not, why do they treat me this way? But what happens if I stop making this easy? That question changed everything. I thought about how often I had anticipated needs before they were voiced. How often I had filled silence with solutions. How often I had softened my opinions to avoid discomfort. None of that had been demanded explicitly. It had been expected because it worked. I realized that my silence wasn't neutral. It was functional. It kept the system stable. And systems resist change. That afternoon, I made a quiet decision. Not to confront anyone, not to explain myself, not to demand anything, just to observe, to stop volunteering, to let things remain undone unless I was directly asked, and even then, to consider my answer instead of defaulting to yes. It felt small, almost insignificant, but it was the first time my silence was intentional rather than habitual. I didn't announce this change. I didn't share it with anyone. Outwardly, nothing shifted. I still showed up, I still smiled, I still participated, but internally, something had recalibrated. I began to notice how quickly others grew uncomfortable when I didn't step in. How confusion replaced expectation. How Mara's confidence faltered slightly when I didn't immediately support or translate her decisions. No one said anything, not yet. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no rush of empowerment, no dramatic sense of reclaiming myself, just a steady, grounded awareness that I had options I hadn't been using. That day wasn't about reclaiming my voice, it was about reclaiming my choice. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being a weakness. When I stopped filling every gap, the gaps didn't disappear. They became visible. At first, the changes were subtle. I didn't remind people of plans. I didn't step in to smooth over awkward moments. I didn't automatically agree when my name was volunteered for something I hadn't consented to. I waited. What happened next was quietly revealing. Conversations stalled where I would normally redirect them. Logistics became messier. Small tensions surfaced that I had previously absorbed without comment. And instead of recognizing my absence as intentional, most people interpreted it as a distraction, or worse, indifference. Mara especially seemed unsettled. She began checking in more often, though not directly. "You're quiet today," she'd say. Or, "You okay?" The tone wasn't concerned, it was an assessment, as if she were trying to determine whether I was still aligned with the role she expected me to play. I answered neutrally. Briefly, truthfully, but without explanation. And that unsettled her more, because silence, when chosen, disrupts predictability. And predictability is what systems rely on to function without question. Others began to fill the space I'd left behind, sometimes clumsily, sometimes resentfully. I noticed how quickly tasks that had once been easy became burdens when redistributed. How often people looked around, expecting someone, me, to intervene. I didn't. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped managing everyone else's comfort. When I let consequences exist without cushioning them. When I allowed my absence to speak for itself. What surprised me was how quickly my silence was reframed as a flaw. "She's distant lately." "She's changed?" "She used to be more helpful." No one asked why. It was easier to assume something was wrong with me than to question the structure that had relied on my quiet labor. And still, I didn't correct them, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was trying to be accurate, to myself. I began to notice how often silence made others project. They filled the unknown with their own interpretations, their own discomfort. And in doing so, they revealed more about their expectations than I ever could have through confrontation. Mara started asserting herself more aggressively, as if volume could replace support. She made decisions faster and spoke over others more frequently. It was subtle, but I could see the strain beneath it. Without my quiet reinforcement, her dominance required more effort. And that effort showed. Still, no one addressed the shift directly. It hovered beneath the surface, unnamed. Tension without language, confusion without accountability. I felt steady, not triumphant, not vindicated, just anchored. Because silence, when it's no longer a default, becomes a boundary. One that doesn't need defending because it isn't explained, it simply exists. And people will always test what they don't understand. I let them. While everyone else was reacting to my silence, no one noticed what I was doing with it. I wasn't withdrawing, I was paying attention. For years, I had been collecting fragments without realizing their value. Conversations overheard, patterns repeated, responsibilities assumed, and then forgotten once completed. Now, with my energy no longer spent on maintaining equilibrium, I had space to see the full picture. And the picture was clearer than I expected. I noticed how often Mara positioned herself as the authority on family matters without actually carrying the responsibility that came with it. She made decisions, but rarely followed through. She delegated, but didn't document. She spoke confidently, but relied on others, often me, to handle the aftermath. I noticed how finances were discussed vaguely, with assumptions instead of clarity. How certain relatives depended on arrangements they barely understood, trusting that someone else had checked the details. I noticed how often my name appeared in email threads, group chats, and informal agreements, as the person who would take care of it, even when no one had asked me directly. And because I had always taken care of it, no one had learned how much that actually involved. What they also didn't notice was my habit of writing things down. Dates, commitments, who said what and when. Not in a conspiratorial way, just accurately. I had done this for years, long before anything felt wrong, because it helped me manage complexity. Because memory, especially in families, is selective. As I reviewed those notes, patterns emerged that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstandings. Responsibilities had been quietly shifted onto me over time. Credit had been redistributed upward. Accountability had been diluted through ambiguity. And beneath it all was an unspoken assumption. Eleanor will handle it. Eleanor always does. That assumption was the lever. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. I didn't correct narratives in real time. Instead, I organized. I cross-referenced. I clarified things privately. Contracts, agreements, expectations that had never been formally acknowledged because they hadn't needed to be. What struck me most was how little resistance I encountered when I asked for documentation or confirmation. People complied easily, almost gratefully, as if part of them had known the system was shaky and had been relying on my quiet competence to keep it standing. Still, no one connected this to my silence. They assumed I was stepping back emotionally, not structurally. They thought I was less involved, not more precise, less present, not more deliberate. Mara, in particular, underestimated the shift. She mistook my restraint for retreat. My lack of reaction is due to a lack of awareness. She continued speaking with the same confidence, unaware that the ground beneath her feet was being mapped in detail. I wasn't preparing to expose anyone. I wasn't planning a reveal. I was preparing for accuracy. Because when the time came, if it came, I wanted clarity, not chaos, truth, not performance. And most importantly, I wanted to be certain that whatever happened next was grounded in fact, not emotion. They never noticed any of this. They never saw the way my silence sharpened my focus, the way stepping out of my assigned role gave me a view of the entire structure. And by the time they did notice something was different, the work had already been done. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself quietly, piece by piece, until there was no denying it. One evening, after organizing my notes into something more coherent, I sat back and looked at what I had in front of me. Not accusations, not interpretations, just facts, timelines, written agreements that had been implied but never formalized, responsibilities that had migrated toward me without acknowledgement, decisions made by others that depended entirely on my follow-through. And then I saw it. I wasn't just the helper, I was the hinge. Certain family arrangements, financial, logistical, even reputational, worked only because I was absorbing their weight. I was the one connecting things that didn't naturally align, the one making sure promises held together long enough to look intentional. Without me, the structure didn't collapse dramatically. It sagged, quietly, in ways that would eventually become visible to everyone. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power over anyone, but that I had been carrying responsibility far beyond what anyone recognized. And because it had never been named, it had never been protected. Not for me. I remember feeling a moment of disbelief, followed by something steadier, resolve. There was no thrill in it, no sense of victory, just clarity. I understood then why my silence had caused such unease, why Mara's confidence had started to feel strained, why I had grown restless. They didn't consciously know what I did, but on some level, they felt the shift. Systems always sense when a load-bearing element stops overcompensating. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized. This wasn't information to be announced. It was something to be handled with care, because leverage, when used carelessly, becomes cruelty. And that wasn't who I wanted to be. Instead, I asked myself a different question. What outcome do I actually want? The answer surprised me with its simplicity. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies extracted under pressure. I didn't even want acknowledgement from everyone. I wanted alignment. I wanted my role to reflect my actual contribution, or to step out of it entirely. I wanted boundaries that didn't require constant enforcement. And I wanted to stop participating in arrangements that depended on my invisibility. That meant change, and change, once initiated, doesn't ask for permission. The private reveal wasn't about discovering others' weaknesses. It was about finally seeing my own position clearly and deciding to treat it with the respect I had been extending outward for years. No one else knew this moment had happened. But from that point on, everything I did was intentional. Once you see the truth clearly, there's a moment where doing nothing becomes a decision in itself. That's where I was. I had options, more than I'd ever allowed myself to acknowledge before. I could continue as I had, armed now with awareness but still playing the same role. I could confront Mara directly, lay everything out, force a conversation that would likely turn defensive before it turned honest. Or I could change the structure quietly, letting outcomes speak where explanations never had. Each option carried a cost. Staying the same would preserve short-term harmony, but require me to keep betraying myself in small, cumulative ways. Confrontation might feel righteous, but it would invite denial, revision, and emotional escalation, things my family was skilled at using to avoid accountability. And once said out loud, truths could be distorted beyond recognition. The third option, the quiet one, felt irreversible. If I changed my participation without announcement, the system would have to adjust on its own. People would feel the impact before they understood the cause. And once that happened, there would be no pretending nothing had changed. That's the option I chose. Not because it was safer, but because it was clean. I decided that I would no longer operate in roles that weren't explicitly acknowledged or reciprocated. I would no longer assume responsibility without a clear agreement. I would stop acting as the invisible connector, the hinge no one named, but everyone relied on. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't punishment. It was alignment. I remember sitting with that decision longer than I expected. Not out of fear, but respect for what it meant. Once enacted, it couldn't be undone without cost. People would react, relationships would shift, some misunderstandings would harden before clarity arrived, if it arrived at all. But something in me was settled. For years, I had equated love with endurance, by absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. Now I understand that endurance without boundaries isn't love, it's erosion. I didn't announce my decision because it didn't require approval. I didn't justify it because it wasn't an argument. It was simply a change in behavior, grounded in facts I no longer ignored. That night, I closed my notebook and put it back on the shelf. Not because I was done paying attention, but because I had reached the point where observation turned into action. Quiet action. This was the last moment where everything still looked the same from the outside. After this, the consequences would begin, whether anyone understood them or not. I didn't disappear. That would have been too noticeable. Instead, I refined my presence. I responded when asked, but only when asked. I confirmed expectations in writing instead of assuming them. I stopped filling in gaps that no one acknowledged existed. And most importantly, I untangled myself from informal arrangements that had relied on my quiet follow-through. This looked on the surface like efficiency, professionalism, maturity. No one questioned it at first. When family logistics came up, I asked clarifying questions instead of offering solutions. Who's handling that? What's the timeline? Is that something you want me to take on? Those questions slowed things down just enough to expose how much had previously been carried by assumption. Mara found this frustrating. She would make declarations, plans, decisions, expectations, and pause, waiting for me to step in and translate them into action. When I didn't, there would be a flicker of irritation, quickly masked. "Well, I guess we'll figure it out," she'd say. And I would nod. Behind the scenes, I was also making practical adjustments. I separated responsibilities that had been loosely bundled together. I documented agreements that had previously lived only in memory. I declined involvement in matters that didn't align with my actual role or capacity, politely, clearly, without explanation beyond the facts. Still, no one confronted me, because nothing I was doing could be framed as unreasonable. I wasn't withdrawing support out of spite. I wasn't creating obstacles. I was simply refusing to compensate for other people's lack of structure. The effect was slow but undeniable. Things took longer. Decisions were revisited, minor errors surfaced, nothing catastrophic, just enough to create discomfort. People began double-checking details they'd never had to think about before. And still, they didn't connect it to me. They assumed circumstances had changed, those things were just more complicated lately, that someone else had dropped the ball. In a way, they were right. I had dropped the ball I was never meant to carry alone. Through all of this, I stayed calm, consistent. I didn't gloat. I didn't hint. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. Silence remained my boundary, not as avoidance, but as integrity. Mara grew sharper in her tone, more impatient. She started reaching out directly, asking if I could just handle certain things like before. I responded the same way every time, with clarity. I can't take that on. That's outside my scope. I'll need that in writing. Each response was brief, neutral, impossible to argue with without revealing something uncomfortable. This was movement without noise, and while no one had named it yet, the system was already straining. The first signs didn't look like consequences. They looked confused. Plans that once moved smoothly now stall. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Small mistakes surfaced. Missed reservations, duplicated efforts, overlooked details. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to create friction. People started feeling it before they understood it. At a family gathering, someone asked why a certain arrangement hadn't been finalized yet. Mara responded quickly, with her usual confidence, but there was a pause afterward. A moment where she seemed to expect something. I'm stepping in, clarifying, fixing. I didn't. The room filled that pause with uneasy laughter. Someone changed the subject, but the discomfort lingered, faint and unresolved. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in tone. Not toward me directly, but in the air around conversations. A subtle impatience, a sense that things were taking more effort than they used to. That's strange, someone said once. Elena usually has this stuff sorted. It was said casually, almost fondly, and still no one asked me. What they felt wasn't anger yet. It was loss, without language. The loss of an invisible stabilizer they hadn't known existed. When systems fail gradually, people search everywhere except the foundation. Mara reacted differently. Her frustration sharpened into control. She began micromanaging details she'd never bothered with before. She corrected people mid-sentence. She asserted certainty where there was none. And each time something slipped through the cracks, her reactions grew more brittle. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, with clarity, because what was happening wasn't punishment. It was exposure. The structure was revealing itself exactly as it was, without my constant reinforcement. At one point, Mara pulled me aside and said, "You've been kind of hands-off lately." I met her eyes and replied evenly, "I'm handling what I agreed to." There was nothing she could argue with in that. Others began to sense tension between us, though nothing explicit had occurred. They tried, gently, to smooth things over, inviting me to help more, hinting at how much I was missed in certain roles. I listened, I declined, and with each refusal, something unspoken became harder to ignore. Things worked better when I overextended myself. And now that I wasn't, the cost of that overextension was becoming visible to everyone else. Still, no one connected it to respect. They connected it to inconvenience. And that was the beginning. The moment panic set in, it didn't announce itself with raised voices or accusations. It arrived as urgency, disguised as concern. Suddenly, people wanted to check in. Conversations that had once been transactional softened at the edges. I received messages that started with, "Just wanted to see how you're doing," and ended with carefully placed requests. At first, they framed it as temporary. "Things have just been hectic lately. We're all a little overwhelmed. It would really help if you could step in on this once." What they were asking for wasn't help. It was a restoration. They wanted the old rhythm back. The one where I absorbed complexity so others didn't have to. The one where my reliability compensated for everyone else's lack of coordination. But they wanted it without renegotiation, without acknowledgement, without change. I could feel the anxiety beneath their politeness. The system was wobbling, and they were trying to stabilize it the only way they knew how. By returning me to my place, Mara was the last to shift tactics, and when she did, it was noticeable. Her confidence cracked into irritation, then into something closer to desperation. She began pushing harder, speaking faster, revising plans midstream. She contradicted herself without realizing it. And when things still didn't resolve cleanly, she started looking for someone to blame. Once, during a tense conversation, she said, "This wouldn't be happening if everyone pulled their weight." The room went quiet. For the first time, I saw uncertainty cross a few faces. No agreement. Not opposition. Just the beginning of doubt. Because people were starting to sense that something fundamental had changed and that it wasn't going to be undone with reminders or pressure. I realized then that we had passed the point of easy repair. Not because I was unwilling to help, but because helping now, without redefining the structure, would reinforce the very dynamics that had made everything unstable in the first place. It would tell them that discomfort could always be outsourced to me if it grew loud enough. So I stayed steady. I responded when appropriate. I declined when necessary. I refused to be rushed into decisions framed as emergencies that existed only because boundaries hadn't been respected earlier. What surprised me was how quickly regret surfaced, not as an apology, but as confusion. I didn't realize how much you handled. We all just assumed you never said it was too much. They weren't wrong, but it was too late for that version of the conversation. Because the issue was never workload, it was worth it. And worth isn't something you renegotiate under pressure. By the time they understood that, the old structure was already gone. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like anything I had once imagined. There was no explosion, no raised voices, no dramatic exit. It happened in the quietest way possible, during a family gathering that was already strained by unspoken tension. We were sitting around the dining table, half-finished plates in front of us. Conversation drifted, stalled, restarted. Then Mara said it. Not loudly, not angrily. Well, she said, with a small dismissive smile, some people just aren't really invested in this family anymore. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The implications settled over the table like cold air. No one spoke. No one challenged her. A few people shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping to their plates. Then she continued. Honestly, she added, if you don't pull your weight, you're kind of unworthy of calling this a family. There it was. Not shouted, not dramatic, just stated, as if she were naming a rule everyone already knew. For a moment, I did nothing. I felt my heart beat, steady and calm. I felt the years of restraint behind me, the clarity I had earned. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to protect anyone else's comfort. Before I could speak, someone else did. My cousin Daniel, quiet, observant, usually content to stay out of family politics, set his fork down gently. That's not fair, he said. The sound of his voice seemed to reset the room. Mara turned toward him, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, he continued evenly, Elena's been pulling more than her weight for years. Just because she stopped covering for everyone doesn't mean she doesn't belong. No one interrupted him. He looked around the table, not at Mara, but at everyone else. Some of us just got used to her making things easy. That doesn't make her unworthy. It makes us spoiled. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was clarifying. I finally spoke then. Not to argue, not to defend myself, but to set something down gently and permanently. I've always cared about this family, I said. I just don't confuse caring with carrying everything anymore. My voice didn't shake. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to, because the heat had drained out of the moment. What remained was truth, exposed, undeniable, and no longer mine alone to hold. Mara said nothing. For the first time, the role she'd relied on, authority without accountability, had no support beneath it. And I realized something important in that moment. Loyalty doesn't always come from who's closest. Sometimes it comes from who's been watching carefully all along. After that night, nothing returned to the way it was. But it also didn't fall apart. That's something people don't talk about enough. That change doesn't always arrive as destruction. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet rebalancing, where what was unsustainable simply stops being propped up. My relationship with Mara became distant, but clearer. There were no dramatic apologies, no attempts to revisit the conversation in private. She adjusted in her own way, less certain, more guarded. Our interactions became polite, limited, and strangely honest in their restraint. I didn't chase resolution. I had learned that closure doesn't always come from mutual understanding. Sometimes it comes from self-respect that no longer requires consensus. Other family members shifted too. Some became more thoughtful about what they asked of me. Others pulled back, unsure how to engage without the old dynamics in place. A few surprised me with quiet gratitude. Acknowledgements slipped into conversations without ceremony. And some relationships faded. I let them, not out of bitterness, but acceptance. Because when a connection exists only as long as you overextend yourself, it isn't a connection, it's a contract, and I had ended mine. What changed most, though, was internal. I no longer measured my value by how useful I was. I no longer softened my voice to be palatable. I spoke when it mattered. I stayed silent when it didn't. And that silence was no longer a burden, it was a choice. I still help, I still care, but now my help is intentional and my care has boundaries. The most unexpected shift was how calm I felt. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just aligned. I had stopped trying to be indispensable. And in doing so, I became unshakable. Daniel and I grew closer after that. Not because of what he said, but because of what his words confirmed. That I wasn't invisible to everyone. That someone had seen the pattern long before I named it. That knowledge didn't inflate my ego. It settled me. This is who I am now. Someone who understands that quiet doesn't mean weak, that loyalty doesn't require self-erasure, and that respect often arrives only after you stop negotiating your worth. When people hear a story like this, they often wait for the moment where everything balances out, where apologies are given, roles are corrected, and everyone walks away wiser and closer than before. That expectation is understandable. We're taught to believe that truth automatically leads to reconciliation, but real life is rarely that tidy. What actually happened after that Christmas dinner was quieter, slower, and more honest than any dramatic resolution could have been. There was no meeting where everything was discussed openly, no family-wide acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, no collective agreement that I had been treated unfairly. And that, strangely enough, was the closure. Because the most important shift didn't happen in them. It happened in me. For years, I believed that my value in the family came from how much I could absorb, how many responsibilities I could take on without complaint, how much discomfort I could neutralize so others didn't have to feel it. I thought love was proven through endurance, through being indispensable, through never becoming a problem. What I didn't understand was that endurance without boundaries slowly teaches people that your limits are negotiable and your dignity is optional. When I stopped overextending myself, I didn't become colder. I became clearer. And clarity has a way of revealing truths that comfort had been hiding. Some relationships adjusted, others thinned out. A few quietly dissolved, not because I pushed anyone away, but because I stopped holding connections together with effort that was never reciprocated. That was painful at times, but it was also instructive. I learned that not every bond is meant to survive honesty, and that doesn't make honesty cruel. My sister and I never had a dramatic reckoning. We didn't need one. Her words at that table and my refusal to shrink in response drew a line that didn't require further explanation. Our relationship now exists at a distance that feels appropriate to what it actually is, not what I once hoped it could be. And that distance is peaceful. The most meaningful thing I gained from this experience wasn't validation, it was self-trust, the ability to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. The confidence to let silence stand without filling it with apologies. The understanding that being calm does not obligate me to be accommodating. I also learned something important about loyalty. It doesn't always come from the people who share your last name or your history. Sometimes it comes from the ones who observe quietly, who don't benefit from your silence, and who are willing to speak when it matters, even if it's uncomfortable. That kind of loyalty doesn't ask you to disappear, it recognizes you as you are. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about confronting every injustice or demanding recognition from people who may never give it. It's about noticing patterns early, about paying attention to who feels entitled to your energy, your labor, your emotional regulation, and who respects your limits when you set them. Because the truth is, you don't owe constant access to anyone who only values you when you're useful. Sometimes the most powerful boundary is simply stepping back and allowing people to experience the weight of what you've been carrying for them. Not to punish, not to teach a lesson, but to restore balance to your own life and to the truth of the situation. So I'll leave you with this question, and I invite you to answer it honestly, even if only to yourself. Where in your life have you been confusing loyalty with self-sacrifice, and what would change if you allowed yourself to be respected instead of relied upon? If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, not for validation, not for debate, but because stories like these remind us that quiet strength is real and that choosing yourself doesn't make you disloyal. Sometimes it simply makes you free.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!